Good morning. Welcome to our class together. I'm glad that you joined me today as we continue our study of 1 Peter. Today we want to look at a situation that is not uncommon, but not as common as Peter knew it to be. We are in 1 Peter chapter 3, first 6 verses today. But let me ask you a simple question to get started. When you got married, how well did you know the person that you married? If people tell the truth, they'll say, well, not as well as I probably could have, or that I do now at least. When Vicki and I were married, we attended the first ever engaged couples retreat hosted by Carl Burkeen and Paul Faulkner at Abilene Christian University. I'll never forget the first words that Paul Faulkner said. The first rattle out of the box, he said, "Our goal this weekend is to break some of you up." To say that people paid attention is kind of an understatement. He had rapt attention from then on. But what he meant was very simple. Some of you don't know the person you want to spend the rest of your life with. And through a series of sessions and diagnostic tests, they wanted couples to look at each other and ask, are we really ready to get married? I've kind of likened that to marrying someone who has a paper bag over her head and not finding out until the wedding night exactly what she looked like. I said, do you want to marry someone that you've never seen before? And that happens sometimes. I remember one couple at that retreat. They met during the week of finals. On the last day before they parted for Christmas break, he proposed to her and she accepted. And so she went home to start planning a May wedding. But they didn't escape the weekend without reconsidering. And sure enough, they ended up not getting married, probably good for them. Peter asks a question, the same question in a different form, especially to husbands and wives. Who are you when you take off your jewelry and your makeup? Now, for most women, that's scary. I visited a woman in the hospital one time. She wouldn't let anybody visit her after surgery because I have not put on my makeup yet and nobody sees me without makeup. But I think that's the problem. It's a crucial question because it affects the eternal destiny, not just of the woman, but also of her husband as well. So let's dive into this passage and find out what's there. He first of all has a word to wives that is distinct and quick and basic. Now we tend to overlook connective words, but we really shouldn't, especially in this passage, because they link a lot of things together that we might miss. So Peter begins the chapter by saying, likewise. Likewise what? What does that mean? It's a glance backwards to gather up pieces that have been strewn along the way that he wants to keep together. And it's the concept that holds it together is the concept called submission. Listen to what Peter has already said. Be subject to the Lord, for the Lord's sake, to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor or as supreme or the governors whom he sends. The first thing he talks about is those people that we are supposed to be subject to as citizens. We're subject to the government. Secondly, he says, servants, be subject to your masters with all respect. If you were a Christian slave, you were supposed to be subject to them or submissive to them. Remember, he's talking about the concept of how do you live in a hostile world as a Christian? You have to prove yourself first as a model citizen, and if you are a slave, you need to prove yourself as a model slave, regardless of the treatment. And so he comes to wives. And all of a sudden, you see the same command, and it's not over, we'll see in next week's lesson. He says, likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands. He advances the thought here. He tells them that as they had been Christian citizens, and if they were Christian slaves, they were to remain under the authority. He gives them the same word that echoes in this passage. It's the word for standing in rank. It's a service word. It's a military word. And it respects the structure that holds all of things together. God creates marriage in a very particular way. And He wants to hold it together with the various roles that are there. Do not read the term inferior when you hear the term submissive. They don't mean the same thing. They don't sound the same way. They don't have anything to do with each other. There may be some very smart privates that are smarter and better mentally and intellectually and emotionally even than a general. But that's not the problem. The problem is the general is still the general, the private is still the private, regardless. One is not inferior to the other. They just stand under the rank. Moderns chafe under that because they hear inferior. Paul does, and Peter never indicates that. To get that out of the Bible, you have to put it there because inspired men didn't write it that way. But to understand this completely, we kind of have to step out of our 21st century minds and slip on the sandals of a woman who has to walk the streets of Ephesus. What's it like for her in the time that she lived? It wasn't pleasant, for their station in life was very, very limited. And depending on where you were, these things blended together. First of all was this Jewish background the church had as well. And the Jewish notion of marriage, of a woman and a wife, was that a woman was a thing that was owned by her husband. He controlled her in all that she did. He could tell her where to go and where not to go. He could instruct her to do almost anything. And we kind of see that concept played out in the instructions about divorce in Deuteronomy chapter 24. Moses said, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and then if she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of the house, and she departs out of his house. Listen to those terms. He's the one that decides what's indecent. He decides whether to maintain the marriage. And he's the one that even determines the meaning of indecent, which got to be a true problem through time and interpretation. Caused a lot of disagreements, as we've seen in Matthew chapter 19. But the man had the sole discretion at defining what indecency was and whether to stay married or not stay married. And when he got a divorce, he sent her away out of his house. It's not a pretty picture. But it was not better once the Greeks got there. The Greeks held that a woman was no more than a toy to be played with by her husband. I think as one Greek writer put it, he said it well. He said, the duty of a woman is to remain indoors and be obedient to her husband. Now, we updated that some. It said wives are supposed to be barefoot and pregnant. It's kind of a coarse Southern way of putting it, but that's the Greek concept. And even for the philosophical Greeks who seemed to be so much more enlightened, a woman had no better status under them. And then came the Romans. And the Romans, with their control-oriented thinking, transferred that over to civil relationships and marital relationships because a woman was someone to dominate and control. And it doesn't take much reading to discover how diminished a role a woman had in the Roman world. One dismissed his wife because she appeared in the streets without a veil. Another divorced his wife because he saw her secretly speaking to a freed woman in the public square. And another one divorced his wife because she went once to the public games. Do you hear what that says? They are to be dominated. So it's not hard to see that this braiding of ideas paints a very bleak picture for women, especially wives. They seem to be powerless. They do seem to be victims of the cruel twist of petulant husbands. Now, moderns have accused Christians of being anti-woman, chauvinistic, male-oriented, despising what the female race can do. But the truth is that Christianity was the great liberating force for women. For in Christ, suddenly, there was no longer male nor female, because before God, they had equal status. They could both go to heaven. They could both serve. They were on same par with God. And while culture made women powerless, Christianity made them powerful. Because they had something that was important. They had the power of influence. They could change things. What kind of power was that? Well, Peter paints a familiar picture. He says, likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. In the New Testament, we read of women being drawn to Jesus and to Christianity. There were the Marys who followed Jesus wherever he went. They were there on the first day of the week to find that the body was gone. In the early chapters of the book of Acts, you read about people like the mother of John Mark providing her home for the prayer meeting that got Peter sprung from jail. Now, but what was typical was a woman would come to Christ, but her husband wouldn't. And he usually wasn't happy with the decision. It was going to take her away from home. It was going to fill her head with all kinds of crazy ideas like the dead living again. And you see this folded into the pages of the New Testament when you come to the story of Timothy. When Paul traveled on a second missionary journey, his first stop was the twin cities of Lystra and Derbe. There he was introduced to someone that would assist him in so many ways he wouldn't even realize the value until later. It says that Paul came to Derbe and to Lystra, and a disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. His mother's a believer, and she had taken her son and raised him to believe as well. But it must have been a tough home life, because it makes you understand, it tells you that his father was a Greek. He had no use for Jews. He had no use for Christian. That was all nonsense to him. Superstition. He had even forbidden his son to be circumcised according to the Jewish law. And it becomes even more clear that it was women, not men, who shaped the life of Timothy. When Paul writes to Timothy, he mentions the influences of his life. As I remember your tears, I long to see you, that you may be filled with joy. I'm reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that first dwelt in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I'm sure dwells in you as well. Notice something about that passage. There is no mention of a male Christian in his life before Paul comes along. Here we meet two women who have husbands because they've had children, but their husbands are either disinterested or just plain old-fashioned hostile to the faith. It was that backdrop that drapes this passage. But Peter says about Christian wives living in a home where they are subject to an unbeliever, that they can make a true difference. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if they do not obey the word, meaning the word of God, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. Peter says they can be won without a word. Does that mean you don't need to tell people anything to become a Christian? No, that's not exactly what this is. We always try to talk people into things. I don't know if you've noticed that. We always try to talk people into things. We are trained talkers. Now, you can read this passage and insert the word nag, I suppose, if you wanted to. That's kind of how it probably comes out. But it's always constantly bringing up a raw subject, and when that happens, the other person mounts another verbal defense. It's how they protect their view. And experience tells us that most of the time, talking creates more resistance, not less. A husband would feel cornered and badgered by his wife, and he might take out a lash on his wife, making her feel like the victim. And usually that starts this cycle that you push me, I push you back. And it's likely then that the marriage would become just a continual playground spat, with all losing the battle and making the wedge of a Christian faith split the marriage. Peter doesn't want that. Peter says that you can win them without a word. Now that probably doesn't mean what we think it means. It doesn't mean win them to Christ. Now that phrase, win for Christ, we're going to win the world, win the lost for Christ. We're going to win the world for Christ. We've heard that expression all of our lives in the church. It's a uniquely American sentiment that comes out of the 20th century sawdust crusades of the traveling preachers. We win the lost, the devil loses them. It's a game that we play with serious consequences. But here, the word doesn't mean to convert completely. It really has the indication that this is to change someone's point of view. A Christian wife takes small steps, and along the way, it reduces hostility and resistance. More living cracks open a door to meaningful discussions that may lead to conversion. But you've got to soften the person, and that's the winning part. You win them to the point of view that this is not as bad as it seems. In fact, it may have a benefit to you. It's not an all or nothing that Peter presents. It's a movement toward a goal. And this passage brings up the unique problem of the problem and opportunity of proximity. In marriage, people live in the closest possible quarters. They share everything. They wake up together, they go to bed together, they eat together, they do everything together. Can you imagine what that does? Now, it brings up both problem and opportunity. When people are thrown together like that, as we've seen during the pandemic, it tells you a lot about what's going on in their marriage. There have been a lot of marriages that have dissolved in the last 18 months because people had to spend too much time and they didn't realize they didn't really care about each other at all. It's kind of like my neighbor. It didn't happen during the pandemic. But I'll never forget, she was out in the street and Vicki was talking to her and I walked up and she and her husband were divorced. We didn't know they were divorced. But I'll never forget her saying, she said, one day I looked at him and I said, ooh. Now I knew her, I figured he probably said the same thing. That's the problem of proximity. It brings you close, and proximity is either a barrier or an open door. How many times has someone known a Christian who didn't exhibit Christian behavior and they said, I know those Christians. They're all hypocrites. They base everything they know on the behavior of a single bad apple. Now we can cry unfair, but that's reality. The closer you get to someone, the more their behavior has to show you what they really do believe in. And if someone has said, I can't hear what you're saying because your life is shouting at me. And many times the Christian message is drowned out by a bad example. Yet Peter says that a well-lived Christian life has great power to change people. Even when mistakes are made, the honesty of confession and humility goes a long way with unbelievers who've met that brusque, holier-than-thou Christian that they can't stand. Imagine a wife who every time she makes a mistake, she apologizes. She accepts responsibility. She wants to do what's right. Even when things go wrong, it's going to be right. You see, and all this concept of proximity happens with because of husbands watching their Christian wives. Peter goes on to say in the second verse, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. When they see. It's a word that means watch carefully. That they're paying attention in every detail. There's an interesting thing that people tend to be looking for a slip up in all of us when they know we're a Christian. Because if they can find the slip up, they can discard the faith quickly. He says they're watching. They're watching closely. When they watch you closely and they see what you are. See, Peter does say that non-Christians observe Christians. Whether we think they do or not, they do. But most of the time they do it to find fault. But if they don't find fault, they're intrigued. What makes these people tick? Why do they act like that? It's a concept that Peter's going to return to later in the chapter. But they're watching the lifestyle of Christians. And so he tells a Christian wife that your husband is inspecting your life, and what he's looking for is respectful and pure conduct. He wants to know if all this is just talk or is it reality. So Peter returns to the word he's used to describe how we respond to God and how slaves respond to masters. That's submission. But he says, with being respectful, same words. Because in last week's lesson, you may remember we mentioned that whatever the respect you gave God is what you need to give to other people. That's the ring of this passage. Just as you respect God, just as you respect the government, just as you respect the master, your wives, you need to have that kind of behavior. Peter adds the term pure. Now in the Roman world, it was associated with pagan temples. And it's part of the instructions and inscriptions put over the temples in that world. And perhaps I suppose the best way to describe it is you need to act as if you were going to meet God. See, that's what should be our daily life. That should be a wife's daily life in the midst of a non-Christian husband. Their life is always like they're meeting God. And think about how that would change the way people who are looking to make a judgment about faith, what they would see if everything that we did was we were living in a way that we were going to meet God today. Now, I think the question is fair to ask, does that really work, or is it just pie in the sky? Is this true but absolutely useless? Well, I think the best example is a woman named Monica. Monica was the mother of the church father, Augustine. She was a devout Christian lady who was active in her faith, but she's the only believer in the household because neither her son nor her husband were Christians. They were at best apathetic. But when Augustine converted to Christ as an adult, he wrote the classic Christian work, Confessions of Augustine. It is one of the pieces of Christian literature that defines so much. And he tells so about his mother. And he says this about her. She's talking about him and his father. She served him, meaning his father, as Lord, and did her diligence to win him unto thee, preaching thee unto him by conversation, meaning behavior, by which thou ornamentest her, making her reverently amiable unto her husband. He said, I watched my mother. She didn't preach to my father. She didn't badger my father. She only showed what she was living for. And over time, things changed. That's the real life application of Peter's principle in this passage. That a consistently well-lived life in front of the non-believer, especially if you're a wife in front of a non-believing husband, has tremendous ability to change minds and hearts. And so Peter goes on to explain how that happens. He says, in contrast, as he explains further, that there's another imperative of something you're not supposed to do. He goes on in verse 3 and says, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear. Peter chooses the word adornment. We know what that is. It's the outward look of someone who's finely dressed. In fact, that term forms the basis of our English word cosmetics. It makes you look good. And he goes on to explain what it means. It includes things like the braiding of hair and the wearing of fine jewelry and fancy clothes. Now, I want to stop for a moment because everybody seems to be tempted at this point in this passage to rush to a judgment. Does Peter teach that women should be plain in their appearance? That they should wear their hair down, no jewelry, the plainest of a cotton dress that hangs down to their ankles, and they never look up? Should wives not care about their appearance? You know, one of the things we do know that a pleasant appearance helps in the attraction of marriage. And I like the story about the woman who woke up and threw on her bathrobe, and as her husband's walking out the door to work, he said, remember, it's trash day, and make sure you take out the garbage so the truck can pick it up. And she got busy, and suddenly she noticed that the trash truck had come and was a few houses down and rolling away. And so she grabbed the trash and started running behind the truck, yelling, is it too late to get some garbage on the truck? The driver said, no, just go ahead and hop on. Is that the way that Peter's trying to say that women can look awful and that's okay? We sure hope not. Yet people have made this point about this passage. Women should wear their hair down, no jewelry, the plainest of dress. And when I was a teenager, preachers hijacked this verse and made it say God is against short skirts. Now, that may be true, but it's a different issue that needs to be discussed here. That goes somewhere else, but not here in the context. Because he goes on to clarify. And he says, but let your adorning be of the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is in God's sight very precious. He speaks of something deeper, something more permanent. He speaks of a woman who is controlled in temperament, doesn't demand her own way. She's pleasant, she's calm, she doesn't shout, she doesn't scream, she doesn't cry to get her own way. And her character tells her story, not her face. The passage contains a contrast between two different ideas. It's not a contrast between makeup or no makeup. That'd be twisting this passage completely out of shape and saying, we're going to make this look as ridiculous as possible. It also doesn't say it gives husbands permission to say, well, you know, hon, I was going to buy you a big diamond ring, but I can't buy that now because the Bible told me I can't. That's absolutely absurd. In a former era, we had problems the same way. We use this passage in certain ways. Early in the 20th century, one of the debates was if the woman happened to own a mink coat, was she permitted to wear it to church? Or did she have to find the oldest cloth coat she could to wear? Now, from today's vantage point, that sounds awfully trivial, but that was the battleground for that idea at one time. See, that's the concept when you talk about makeup or no makeup. But that's not what Peter's trying to say. He says the contrast is between superficial beauty and beauty based on character. Some women base their whole lives on their outward appearance. They want to impress others by their wealth or their youth. And so they go overboard to prove it. Are you aware that in our modern society, we worship youth and looks? And because of that, plastic surgery has grown by 250,000 cases every year for the last 10 years. And as one plastic surgeon advertises, we can remake your whole life with this procedure. Really? Your whole life? Not hardly. Because you see, the tragedy of shallowness is that many are hiding something with this outward adornment. They don't have anything inside. And all they can do is dress up the outside to look good. I like what Isaiah said, him and the other prophets as well. They said there were women, Jewish women, that they preached to, who made up their outside lives so well to hide their own spiritual emptiness and ugliness. Isaiah chapter 3, he says, in that day, the day of judgment, the Lord will take away the finery of the anklets, the headbands and the crescents, the pendants, the bracelets and the scarves, the headdresses, the amulets, the sashes, the perfume boxes and the amulets, the signet rings and nose rings, the festal robes and the mantles, the cloaks and the handbags, the mirrors, the linen garments, the turbans and the veils. Instead of perfume, there will be rottenness. Instead of a belt, a rope. Instead of well-set hair, baldness. Instead of a rich robe, a skirt of sackcloth and branding instead of beauty. What Isaiah was trying to tell them is, you've been spending your whole life trying to make your outside look good, that you have neglected the spiritual thing that would have changed your whole future. Because when he speaks that, he talks about a corrupt society, and part of a corrupt society is we want to look good without being that way. And so the Lord was going to remove the exterior good looks, and it was going to reveal exactly who they were in spirit. Now, Peter reminds us that over time, external beauty fades, and all that is left is character of the heart. You know, beauty queens become wrinkled. There are models, they gain weight in middle age too, and glamour tends to be replaced by achy joints and a stiff neck. Just because you have it now or because you have it on the outside doesn't mean that's who you are. That just may mean what you're hiding. You see, we spend a lot of money and a lot of time trying to become good-looking corpses, rather than taking the effort to be genuine before the world. And Peter asked wives to decide what they want their husbands to see. A gentle and quiet spirit, or an image that fades with age. Truth be told, most men want a woman who cares for them, because they know looks fade as theirs does. Only the most shallow want something else. So Peter says, be the woman of character, because that is what will speak to your husband's deepest needs. But he wants to leave them with an example. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands. As Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you are her children if you do good Do not fear anything that is frightening. When a wife does this, she's following in giant footprints. We tend to forget Sarah when we read Genesis. When Abraham hears the call to go to Canaan, which seems like an insanity moment to most of the people there, Sarah silently goes with him. She tolerated him, putting her in the dangerous position of adultery with lecherous rulers. She never owned anything like other women did, but she gathered her tents and wandered with him. She is the example of someone who submitted. She called him Lord, not as a title, but through the obedience and submissiveness of a wife. Her example did the talking. Now, most make the assumption that this only works if you have a good husband. Well, if I had an Abraham, I could be like that too. That's not what Peter says. Even if you're in a very difficult situation, even if there's one in which you could be afraid, he says you have nothing to fear if you do good. There is this implied mention of God's care with a woman of character. If you do right, God takes care of the rest. Now, I've known many Christian women married to non-Christian husbands, and some of these husbands just ignored them. Some were actively hostile. And I admire them for maintaining their faith in the light of all the things that they took. It's not only about Christian wives with unbelieving husbands. I think this works in reverse as well. I know that, in fact. When I was a boy, I was impressed by a guy at church named Bill. Now, Bill's wife never darkened the door of the church. In the whole 8 years I knew him, I never saw his wife. Never did. I always wondered what his marriage must have been like. But I do know what I could see. Bill had 3 little girls. The oldest was my age. The others were younger. I want you to think about that picture for a moment. You got 3 little girls, probably the oldest, maybe 8 or 9. And every Sunday and Sunday night and Wednesday night, Bill made sure they were dressed properly for church, and he did their hair, and he brought them all by himself without any support from his wife, maybe even with resistance from his wife. But I dare say today that wherever those women are, they are God's women because of a father who maintained his Christian character in the face of opposition. And I know of men who are Christian men today because of their mothers who stood the opposition of a non-Christian husband with grace and dignity and Christian commitment. See, when I looked at Bill, he showed me the broader application of what a Christian does when he's married to a non-Christian spouse. But as we come to the close, what guideposts along the way that we can give wives who are in a situation that Peter describes? I think first is a wife is responsible for who they are, not what their husbands do. Husbands in these situations can do almost anything imaginable to stop Christian faith. A wife can't worry about whether the husband cares or not cares. They can't worry about whether he responds or doesn't respond. She can only say, my faith is important and I will do that because that's her lifeline, regardless of what he does. Stay the course. Maintain your faith. Secondly, who you are always goes with you. I continue to be troubled by the inclination of many Christian couples to seek a divorce, thinking it's going to be better the next time. It's not. Many times they just find themselves in another miserable marriage just as bad, if not worse than the first, and they wonder what happened. But they've forgotten a simple idea. You bring your character into a marriage, and changing your circumstances doesn't change who you are, because as the saying goes, wherever you go, there you are. If you want to change your marriage, change your character, not your spouse. The third, trust the Lord to do what you cannot do. A lot of life is out of our control. We can do what the Bible says, but the lives can speak, but people may or may not change. No one can make someone peaceful or compliant. Just reality. No one can force the gospel on someone or manipulate them into becoming a genuine Christian. In fact, that's not just wrong. It doesn't work. Live the life that you know to live. And trust God to do what is beyond your capacity to do. And if you continue to follow the Lord will find a way. Thank you for joining me this morning. I hope we've enjoyed our lesson together. And I'll see you again next week when we talk more about 1 Peter. Have a great day.